The morning of September 23rd, 1818, broke over London with a peculiar stillness. The kind of autumn dawn where the world seems to pause between summer's ending and winter's beginning. A thin mist clung to the windows of the East family's Mayfair townhouse, softening the sharp edges of the fashionable square below. Inside, the household had been alive with purposeful activity since before first light. Fires stoked in every grate. Hot water carried up the servant stairs in an endless procession, and flowers from the Ashford estate's renowned conservatory arranged throughout the reception rooms. In the largest bedchamber of the East Wing, Sharon A. East stood motionless before the tall cheval mirror as her lady's maid, Mrs. Hewitt, fastened the final pearl button at the back of her wedding gown. The gown itself was a triumph of craftsmanship, ivory silk that had travelled from the workshops of Lyon, overlaid with Honiton lace so intricate that 3 seamstresses had spent 8 months bringing it to life. The bodice had been embroidered with a design that intertwined the East family crest with the merchant ducal coronet, a visual declaration of the alliance that had been decided over her cradle 23 years ago. Every stitch represented a promise, every pearl an expectation.
"You are perfection itself, Miss Sharon,"
murmured Mrs. Hewitt, her voice catching slightly as she adjusted the lace-cap sleeves with reverent fingers. The maid had served the East household since Sharon was 5 years old, and her weathered hands trembled as she stepped back to survey her work.
"His Grace is the most fortunate man in England."
Sharon examined her reflection with the detached precision she'd been trained to employ. The young woman gazing back at her was everything she'd been sculpted to become. Porcelain complexion carefully maintained, dark hair dressed in an elaborate coiffure, beneath a wreath of orange blossoms and seed pearls, storm-grey eyes framed by dark lashes. A discreet touch of rouge warmed her cheeks, and the family's heirloom sapphires glittered at her throat, a loan from her mother for this momentous day. Only the slight rigidity of her gloved fingers, clasped together at her waist, betrayed anything beneath the serene surface. This day represented the culmination of Sharon's entire existence, the moment when Sharon A. East would finally become Her Grace, the Duchess of Ashford, fulfilling the destiny that had been written in legal script before she'd taken her first steps.
"Thank you, Mrs. Hewitt,"
she said quietly, her fingers rising to touch the sapphire pendant that rested against her collarbone. It had arrived that morning with a brief note in Patrick's formal hand. "Until this evening, when I may place the ducal coronet upon your head. P.M.
"Everything I have done has led to this moment."
And it was true. Since the afternoon,
when her father, Lord George East, and the late Duke of Ashford had signed the betrothal contract in the study downstairs. Their hands clasped over the document, while infant Sharon slept in the nursery above. She had been prepared for this singular purpose. Every accomplishment in her repertoire had been acquired with the role of Duchess in mind. She spoke French with Parisian fluency, Italian with Florentine grace, German with Viennese precision, and had recently added conversational Spanish at her mother's insistence. Her fingers could navigate Scarlatti's most demanding harpsichord passages with flawless technique. Even if her music master had occasionally suggested she might try to feel the notes rather than simply execute them. She could sketch acceptable watercolors of country estates, embroider with invisible stitches, and recite the labyrinthine rules of precedence and protocol that governed every interaction in their rarefied world. And somewhere during those years of careful cultivation, duty had transformed into something resembling devotion. Sharon had met Patrick M. Merchant only intermittently, always under the watchful eyes of chaperones, always within the prescribed boundaries of propriety. A spring dinner at Ashford House when she was 17, where he'd complimented her fluency in French. A summer garden party at the ducal estate when she was 19, where he'd walked beside her through the rose garden and discussed the responsibilities of their future stations. Once, memorably, at Covent Garden,
where they'd shared a box for an Italian opera, and he'd nodded approvingly at her whispered translation of the libretto. His reserve had seemed dignified rather than cold, his formal courtesy the mark of good breeding. From these sparse encounters, Sharon's dutiful heart had constructed an elaborate architecture of affection. In the privacy of her journal, locked away in her writing desk, she'd practiced her new signature in careful copperplate. Sharon Merchant, Duchess of Ashford. Each iteration had felt like a prayer.
"The coach has arrived, Miss Sharon,"
announced Porter, the family's elderly butler, from the doorway. His usually impassive expression softened almost imperceptibly as he regarded the bride.
"Lord East is waiting to escort you."
Sharon drew in a measured breath, steadying the flutter of nerves in her chest. Mrs. Hewitt lifted the cathedral-length veil, more exquisite Honiton lace, edged with silk ribbon, and carefully arranged it over Sharon's face. The world softened behind the delicate barrier, everything rendered slightly hazy and dreamlike. The veil created a gossamer threshold between who she had been and who she was about to become. As she descended the curved staircase, one gloved hand resting lightly on Porter's offered arm, Sharon caught her reflection in the gilt-framed mirror on the landing. For just a moment, so brief she might have imagined it, she didn't recognize the woman in bridal white,
her features obscured by expensive lace, her body constrained by whalebone and silk. The thought vanished as quickly as it had come. Her father waited in the entrance hall, imposing in his formal attire, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and anticipation. Outside, the wedding coach stood ready, its white-ribboned horses stamping impatiently. All of London's elite waited at St. George's Chapel. Patrick waited at the altar. Sharon's life was about to begin. Or so she believed. The central aisle of St. George's Chapel stretched before Sharon like an infinite ribbon of polished marble, each step echoing beneath the soaring vaulted ceiling. A gloved hand rested on her father's arm, which was rigid as iron beneath the fine wool of his coat. She could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes tracking her progress. Every member of England's aristocracy who mattered was here, positioned in the pews according to their rank and consequence. The morning light filtered through the stained glass windows, casting jeweled patterns across the ancient stone, and the air was thick with the scent of hothouse roses and beeswax candles. Sharon kept her gaze fixed forward, through the gossamer veil, toward the figure waiting at the altar. Patrick M. Merchant stood tall and impeccable in his formal attire, his golden hair gleaming in the diffused light, his aristocratic features composed in an expression of appropriate solemnity. He was everything a duke should be: handsome, dignified, the embodiment of nobility. She tried to summon the tender feelings she was supposed to harbor for her betrothed, the affection she'd cultivated so carefully in her journal entries. Instead, her attention snagged on the front pew, where her younger sister Laura sat radiant in rose silk, her blonde curls catching the light, her expression one Sharon couldn't quite decipher. Anticipation, nervousness, something else entirely. Her father released her arm at the altar steps, and Sharon took her place beside Patrick. The Archbishop of Canterbury himself had consented to perform the ceremony, a testament to the importance of this union. His voice roared through the chapel with practiced gravity as he began the ancient words. Sharon's heart beat against her ribs like a trapped bird. And then Patrick raised his hand. The gesture silenced the Archbishop mid-sentence. The sudden absence of sound was more deafening than any scream. Sharon felt time stretch and distort, each second expanding into an eternity, as Patrick turned to face the congregation, rather than her. "I cannot proceed with this marriage." His voice was clear, cold, and carried effortlessly through the chapel. Sharon's breath stopped in her chest. Miss Sharon East is technically accomplished. Her education is exemplary, her skills beyond reproach.
But I have come to realize that technical perfection is not the foundation for a marriage. Her younger sister,
Miss Laura East, possesses a vitality, a genuine warmth and refreshing spontaneity that makes her the more suitable Duchess of Ashford.
The chapel erupted. Gasps, whispers, the rustle of silk as bodies turned to stare. Sharon felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, felt the architecture of her entire existence collapse inward. But 23 years of training held her upright. Her face remained a perfect mask of composure as she reached down with trembling fingers and slowly, deliberately, removed the Duke's sapphire betrothal ring from her left hand. She placed it on the altar with careful precision, the small click of metal against marble, cutting through the chaos. Then she turned. The aisle that had seemed infinite moments ago now stretched before her like a gauntlet. Sharon lifted her chin, straightened her spine, and began to walk. Alone. Past the rows of shocked, pitying, scandalized faces, past her mother's theatrical weeping and her father's murderous rage, past Laura, whose face had gone pale as milk. Sharon walked with glacial dignity, each step measured and controlled, while inside her chest, the woman she had spent her entire life becoming shattered into 1,000 irretrievable pieces. The moment Sharon stepped through the chapel doors into the autumn morning, the carefully constructed facade cracked like fine porcelain struck by a hammer. The crowd that had gathered outside, curiosity seekers, lesser gentry hoping for a glimpse of ducal splendor, pressed forward with eager, vulture-like interest. Their whispers crashed over her in waves, each syllable a fresh cut. Rejected. Humiliated. The sister. Did you hear? Technically accomplished, but insufficient. Poor girl. What a scandal. Sharon's breath came in short, panicked gasps beneath her veil. Her father materialized beside her, his face purple with rage, already calculating political salvage strategies with the ruthless precision of a man who viewed his daughter's devastation as primarily a loss of leverage. Her mother's theatrical sobs punctuated the chaos, though whether Lady East wept for her daughter's pain or the family's tarnished reputation remained unclear. Probably the latter. The carriage, now! Her father's grip on her elbow was bruising. We return home immediately to manage this disaster. Home. The word struck Sharon with visceral revulsion. She could not return to that Mayfair townhouse, could not bear to become the living monument to the East family's humiliation, an object of pity displayed in drawing rooms while her parents negotiated the wreckage of their ambitions. She would suffocate there, crushed beneath the weight of their disappointment and society's schadenfreude. No. The word emerged hoarse but definite. Sharon pulled her arm free and turned to the waiting coachman, whose weathered face showed uncommon sympathy. Take me to Bath, to Mrs. Marguerite Ashworth's residence on Royal
Crescent. Her mother's sobs intensified into shrill protests. Her father began a blustering command. Sharon ignored them both, climbing into the carriage with the last reserves of her dignity and pulling the door shut with decisive finality. As the vehicle lurched into motion, she collapsed against the velvet cushions, finally allowing the veil to slip from her face. The streets of London blurred past the window, a watercolor painting dissolving in rain. The journey to Bath passed in merciful numbness, hours compressed into a fog of shock. Sharon barely registered the changing landscape, the city giving way to countryside, the autumn colors blurring into meaningless abstraction. She existed in suspension, untethered from everything she'd believed herself to be. Aunt Marguerite's residence materialized like sanctuary as dusk fell. The widow answered the door herself, a tall, spare woman of 50, with sharp gray eyes and iron gray hair dressed simply. She took one look at Sharon's haunted face, still framed by the elaborate bridal coiffure now listing to one side, and asked no questions. Instead, she simply opened her arms.
Come inside, child.
Once Sharon was settled by the fire, with brandy she couldn't taste, Marguerite finally spoke, her voice crisp with barely contained fury.
Patrick Merchant is a fool of monumental proportions. Worse, he's a coward who lacked the decency to spare you public humiliation. He chose Laura,
Sharon whispered.
He found me insufficient. He freed you from a luxurious prison,
Marguerite corrected sharply.
before the door locked permanently behind you. That's not a tragedy, my dear. It's a blessing, disguised as humiliation.
Sharon retreated into Marguerite's library the way a wounded animal seeks a cave, instinctively, desperately, needing darkness and silence to survive. The room was smaller than her father's grand library in London, but warmer somehow, lined floor to ceiling with books that showed signs of actual reading rather than decorative arrangement. She spent the first 3 days in her nightdress, curled in the window seat overlooking the crescent, surrounded by volumes she'd never had time to explore when every hour had been allocated to Duchess preparation. She discovered Jane Austen first, and the irony of reading about marriage plots while her own had spectacularly imploded was not lost on her. But Austen's heroines questioned, chose, rejected suitors based on genuine feeling rather than social advantage. Sharon had never been permitted such luxuries. She moved on to Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication, and the words struck her like physical blows. Women are told from their infancy that beauty is woman's scepter. The mind shapes itself to the body, and roaming round its gilt cage, only seeks to adorn its prison. Sharon's hands trembled as she read. The gilt cage, the adorned prison. That was precisely what she'd been. A beautifully trained captive who'd mistaken her constraints for destiny. Byron's poetry came next. All passion and rebellion, and dangerous questions about duty versus desire. Sharon had been taught to appreciate poetry technically, to recognize meter and rhyme scheme. She'd never been encouraged to feel it, to let it crack open something inside her chest. Slowly, painfully, like pressing on a bruise to determine its depth, Sharon began examining the life she'd nearly lived. She barely knew Patrick, beyond a handful of formal dinners and rigidly chaperoned walks. She couldn't recall a single conversation of substance between them. Only his approving nods when she demonstrated her linguistic abilities, or correctly identified the rank of obscure continental nobility. Their engagement had been a transaction, finalized in infancy, never a courtship. She'd been so focused on becoming worthy of him that she'd never questioned whether he was worthy of her. More devastatingly, Sharon realized she barely knew herself. Every accomplishment in her repertoire had been acquired to fulfill someone else's requirements. Did she actually enjoy playing the pianoforte? Or had she simply become proficient because duchesses were expected to provide musical entertainment? Did she prefer French literature to English? Or had she absorbed her tutor's preferences as her own? What did Sharon East actually want, divorced from the expectations that had shaped her since birth? The question terrified her more than Patrick's rejection ever had. On the 5th morning, Marguerite swept into the library with the determination of a general planning an assault. "Enough!" she announced, pulling back the curtains Sharon had kept drawn. Sunlight flooded the room mercilessly. "You cannot hide in here forever, reading about other people's lives while refusing to live your own." "I'm not ready. You'll never be ready. Readiness is a myth we tell ourselves to justify cowardice." Marguerite's tone was brisk, but not unkind. "Tonight there's a poetry reading at the Assembly Rooms. Small, intellectual, nothing like those dreadful London affairs. You're coming with me. People will stare. They'll whisper about, let them stare, let them whisper.
Marguerite's grey eyes flashed.
You've spent your entire life performing for audiences, Sharon. Perhaps it's time you stopped caring what they think.
That evening, Sharon found herself dressed in a simple gown of deep green, one of Marguerite's, altered to fit, standing at the threshold of Bath's assembly rooms. Her hands were shaking, but Marguerite's firm grip on her elbow propelled her forward, through the doors, into whatever came next. The assembly rooms were mercifully smaller than the grand ballrooms of London, though Sharon felt the weight of every curious glance as she entered. Recognition flickered across several faces. The jilted East daughter, object of the
season's most sensational scandal. And she saw heads bent together, whispers exchanged behind gloved hands. Sharon lifted her chin and kept walking. The dark green silk made her feel less like the rejected bride in ivory lace, and more like someone who might actually exist independent of that humiliation. The poetry reading had already begun. A thin young man with wire spectacles stood at the front, reciting Wordsworth with admirable passion, if questionable meter. Sharon and Marguerite slipped into seats near the back. For the first time since the chapel, Sharon felt herself breathe properly. This wasn't a society event orchestrated around rank and strategic marriages. These were people gathered for ideas, for art, for something beyond shallow social maneuvering. During the interval, as guests mingled over wine and quiet conversation, Sharon remained in her seat, grateful for momentary invisibility. Then a voice spoke beside her, low and thoughtful. The Coleridge was better than the Wordsworth, I thought, though perhaps that's sacrilege in some circles. Sharon looked up to find a man she hadn't noticed before, dark-haired, perhaps 30, with an intensity in his gray eyes that suggested he actually saw her, rather than simply the scandal she represented. He was tall, dressed well but not ostentatiously, with the kind of aristocratic features that would have been handsome if they weren't marked by such evident sadness. "Not sacrilege," Sharon replied carefully. "Simply discernment. The gentleman's enthusiasm exceeded his technical skill." His mouth curved slightly. A diplomatic assessment. I would have said he murdered the rhythm, but perhaps I'm less charitable. He extended his hand. "Adrian Blackwell, Earl of Westmarch, and you, I believe, are braver than most of this room combined." Sharon's defenses rose instinctively. "I'm not looking for pity, my lord." "Good. I wasn't offering any." Adrian's gaze remained steady, neither pitying nor judgmental. "I was observing that it takes considerable courage to appear in public when society has designated you this season's cautionary tale. Most would have fled to the countryside indefinitely." Despite herself, Sharon felt something loosen in her chest. "I did flee to the countryside. Bath hardly counts as London." "Bath is civilized exile rather than true retreat. The distinction matters." Adrian gestured to the empty seat beside her. "May I? I find myself weary of conversations about the weather and everyone's digestive complaints." Sharon nodded, and Adrian sat. What followed was unlike any conversation she'd had in her carefully chaperoned life. They discussed the poetry. Adrian's observations were sharp and well-read, revealing genuine engagement with literature rather than superficial familiarity. They moved to philosophy, to questions of duty versus individual will, to the constraints society placed on human potential. Adrian spoke to her as if her thoughts had value, as if her mind mattered independent of her marriageability or social utility. For the first time in weeks, Sharon smiled genuinely. "You're not like the others here," she ventured during a pause. "Neither are you." Adrian's expression darkened briefly. "I lost my wife and daughter 3 years ago. childbirth complications. Afterward, I found I had very little patience for society's shallow rituals. The endless rounds of meaningless pleasantries, the strategic marriages, the pretense that any of it matters, when life can end so arbitrarily. He met her eyes. I suspect you understand something about displacement. About discovering the world you prepared for isn't the world you'll actually inhabit. Sharon's throat tightened. Yes, I understand that precisely. As the reading resumed, Adrian leaned closer. Might I have permission to call on you, Miss East? I find myself hoping this conversation need not end tonight. Sharon looked at him, this dark-haired stranger, with shadows matching her own, and felt something unexpected. Not the dutiful affection she'd manufactured for Patrick, but genuine curiosity, a desire to know more. Yes, she said quietly. I would like that. Adrian called the following afternoon, and then the afternoon after that, and soon his visits became a rhythm Sharon found herself anticipating, with something dangerously close to joy. Marguerite chaperoned, with the bare minimum of propriety required. Present, but pointedly absorbed in her embroidery, allowing conversations to unfold without constant supervision. They walked through Sydney Gardens as autumn deepened into early winter, the paths lined with bare branches and the last stubborn leaves clinging to their stems. Their conversations ranged far beyond the careful platitudes Sharon had exchanged with Patrick. In a bookshop on Milsom Street, surrounded by the scent of leather and paper, Adrian spoke about his wife's death with raw honesty. Catherine was her name. She was kind, gentle, everything a wife should be according to society's measure. But when she died, when our daughter died with her, I learned that titles and wealth provide no protection against life's fundamental cruelties. He turned to Sharon then, his grey eyes dark with remembered grief. I realized I'd been living a life that looked impressive from the outside, while being hollow at its core. We must build lives worth living, not merely lives that look impressive to observers who don't actually care about our happiness. The words struck Sharon like a key turning in a lock. That was precisely what she'd been doing, constructing an impressive facade, while never questioning whether the structure behind it had any genuine foundation. In the gardens one afternoon, as weak November sunlight filtered through clouds, Sharon found herself articulating pain she'd barely admitted to herself. Patrick's betrayal hurt, she said slowly, watching her breath. Mist in the cold air. But the deeper wound is realizing the entire system betrayed me long before he did. I was groomed to be decorative, accomplished in ways that would reflect well on my husband's taste. Not educated to think independently or choose my own path. I was being shaped into an ornament, not cultivated as a person. Adrian stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Sharon. The use of her given name, though improper, felt right somehow. Patrick's rejection was his failure of perception, not your failure of worth. He looked at you and saw only what you'd been trained to be, never recognizing who you actually are. And who am I? The question emerged smaller than she'd intended, revealing the terrifying uncertainty at her core. A woman of remarkable intelligence who's been taught to hide it behind appropriate modesty. Someone with genuine strength who's been told that strength in women is unbecoming. A person of grace who's discovering that grace doesn't require self-erasure. Adrian's voice was quiet, but absolutely certain. Patrick wanted a Duchess. What he failed to see was that he was offered a partner, someone capable of thought, growth, genuine companionship, His loss, Sharon. Entirely his loss. Something cracked open in Sharon's chest, not breaking, but opening, like ice splitting to reveal running water beneath. For 23 years, she'd believed her value was contingent on external approval, on successfully fulfilling a predetermined role. Adrian's conviction that she possessed inherent worth, worth independent of duties performed or expectations met, was revolutionary. "You make it sound simple," she whispered. "It's not simple at all. It's terrifying." Adrian offered his arm as they resumed walking. Discovering who you are rather than who you were told to be, that's the hardest work there is. But I believe you're capable of it. As November gave way to December, Sharon found herself imagining futures she'd never dared consider before. Not a life arranged by contract, but one built on genuine choice. Not partnership as transaction, but partnership as true companionship. And increasingly, when she imagined that future, Adrian was standing beside her. The letter arrived on a gray December morning, delivered with the other post, and distinguished only by her mother's rigid, unforgiving script. Sharon took it to Marguerite's morning room, where weak winter sunlight struggled through the windows and broke the seal with fingers that had stopped trembling weeks ago. The contents were precisely what she'd expected. Patrick and Laura's wedding had been officially announced to take place before Christmas at the Duke's country estate. A smaller affair than Sharon's would have been, her mother noted with bitter emphasis, as the scandal had necessitated discretion. The letter then descended into recriminations. Her father remained apoplectic. The
family's political standing had suffered considerably, and Sharon's continued absence from London was being interpreted as cowardice rather than dignity. Lady East's prose dripped with accusation, as though Sharon's humiliation had been a deliberate act of sabotage against the family's interests. Sharon read it twice, waiting for the pain to arrive. Instead, she felt only a distant, settling calm. Where she'd anticipated fresh wounds, she found something closer to closure. Patrick had made his choice. Laura had made hers. Neither decision had anything to do with Sharon's actual value, only with their own desires and Patrick's particular blindness. She realized, with crystalline clarity, that she no longer wanted what they had. The life she would have lived as Duchess of Ashford unfolded in her imagination with disturbing vividness. Managing a vast household she hadn't chosen, hosting endless parties for people whose company she didn't enjoy, bearing children primarily to continue the merchant lineage, performing the role of ornamental Duchess, while her thoughts and desires remained carefully hidden. That wasn't a lost paradise. It was a narrowly avoided prison, exactly as Marguerite had insisted from the beginning. Sharon folded the letter carefully and set it in the fire, watching the paper blacken and curl. That evening, Adrian found her in Marguerite's small garden, wrapped in a shawl against the December cold, reading by the last light of dusk. He sat beside her on the stone bench without speaking, simply present in the comfortable silence they'd developed. "News from London," Sharon said finally. "Patrick and Laura marry before Christmas." Adrian's jaw tightened slightly, but his voice remained even. "How do you feel?" "Relieved." The word surprised her even as she spoke it, but it was true. "I thought I would feel diminished somehow, but instead I feel—" She searched for the right description. "Free. As though the last thread connecting me to that life has finally been severed." Adrian studied her face in the fading light. "If you could write your own future now," he said quietly, "unconstrained by what you were told you should want, what would it look like?" Sharon turned the question over carefully,
letting herself truly consider it for the first time. Not what her parents wanted, not what society expected, but what she actually desired for her own life. The answer came with startling, perfect clarity. "It would look like this," she said, meeting his eyes. "Like conversations that challenge me rather than flatter me. Like days spent reading and thinking instead of performing accomplishments for an audience. Like a partnership built on genuine affection and intellectual companionship, rather than genealogical strategy and contractual obligation." She paused, heart beating faster. "It would look like the life I've been living these past months. The one I didn't know I was allowed to want." Adrian's expression transformed. Hope and
something deeper flickering across his features. He took her hand, his touch warm against her cold fingers. "Sharon," he said, and the way he spoke her name felt like a question and an answer simultaneously. The garden was dark now, lit only by lamplight spilling from Marguerite's windows, but Sharon had never seen her path forward more clearly. Adrian arrived the following afternoon with an unusual intensity in his expression, asking if Sharon would walk with him through Sydney Gardens, despite the threatening clouds massing overhead. Marguerite raised an eyebrow, but nodded permission, and Sharon found herself wrapped in her cloak, walking beside him along the familiar paths now stripped bare by winter. "I've been thinking," Adrian began, his voice taut with something Sharon couldn't quite identify, "about these past months, about what your presence in my life has meant." He paused, seeming to gather courage. "When Catherine died, I believed the best parts of myself died with her. The capacity for hope, for genuine connection, for imagining a future worth building. I resigned myself to existing rather than living." Sharon's heart began beating faster. The sky darkened overhead, wind picking up through the skeletal trees. "But meeting you, knowing you, has awakened something I thought was gone forever. Not a replacement for what I lost," he said quickly, turning to face her. "Something entirely new. You've reminded me that life can be chosen rather than simply endured, that partnership can be built on authentic regard rather than social convenience." The first drops of rain began falling, cold and insistent. Adrian took her hand, leading her quickly toward the small pavilion overlooking the Kennet and Avon Canal. They reached it just as the rain intensified, drumming on the wooden roof with increasing force. Mist rose from the water's surface, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made the rest of the world feel very far away. Adrian still held her hand. In the gray light, with rain creating a curtain around them, he looked at her with such naked hope that Sharon's breath caught. "Sharon," he said, and then, deliberately, he knelt. Not the formal, performative gesture she'd seen at society proposals, but something raw and genuine. "I'm not going to offer you what Patrick did. I can't restore your social standing in London or give you a dukedom. I can't undo the humiliation you suffered or return you to the life you were supposed to have." He took both her hands in his, looking up at her with absolute sincerity. "What I can offer is a life of choice, a partnership where your thoughts matter as much as your accomplishments, where you're valued for who you are rather than what role you can perform. I see the woman you're becoming, Sharon. Brilliant, strong, finding her own voice after years of being told to speak only prescribed lines. That woman, not the Duchess you were, groomed to be, is who I'm asking to share my life." Tears blurred Sharon's vision, but she didn't look away. "I offer you my home in Westmarch, not grand like Ashford,
but comfortable, and yours to shape as you wish. My library, every book in it, yours to read without asking permission. My friendship, my partnership, my love, freely given, not contractually obligated. His voice dropped to something barely audible above the rain. Will you marry me? Not because tradition dictates it, or families have arranged it, but because you want to. Sharon looked down at this dark-haired man, kneeling in a rain-swept pavilion, offering her everything Patrick never had. Genuine regard, intellectual equality, the freedom to be herself, rather than a carefully constructed performance. The answer had been forming in her heart for weeks, perhaps since that first conversation at the poetry reading.
Yes,
she said, the word emerging clear and certain.
Not because I must, Adrian. Because I want to. Because I choose you. And I choose the life we could build together.
He stood, and when he kissed her, their first kiss, unhurried and tender, Sharon understood the difference between duty and desire, between obligation and choice. The rain continued falling, but inside the pavilion, Sharon had never felt warmer. News of Sharon's engagement to Adrian Blackwell, Earl of Westmarch, reached London like lightning splitting a summer sky. Society, which had been composing Sharon's epitaph as this season's most pitiable cautionary tale, suddenly found itself without a satisfying narrative. The woman publicly rejected by a duke had chosen an earl, not a desperate scramble for salvaged respectability, but apparently a genuine love match. The gossips didn't know whether to call it romantic redemption or calculated defiance, and their confusion was almost as satisfying as their scandal had been devastating. Sharon received a flurry of letters. Her mother's was predictably cold, noting that while an earl was acceptable if hardly ideal, at least Sharon had avoided complete ruination. Her father wrote nothing. But there was also a brief note from Laura, surprisingly warm, wishing Sharon happiness and confessing, in careful script, that she hoped they might one day reconcile. Sharon set that letter aside to consider later, when the wounds were less fresh. She and Adrian married on a clear January morning in Bath Abbey, deliberately choosing simplicity over spectacle. The guest list numbered fewer than 20. Marguerite, naturally, positioned prominently as matron of honor, a handful of Adrian's university friends, the few Bath acquaintances who'd shown Sharon genuine kindness rather than morbid curiosity, and Mrs. Hewitt, who'd travelled from London against Lady East's express orders and wept openly throughout the ceremony. There were no society reporters sketching the bride's gown for the illustrated papers, no political negotiations conducted in antechambers, no 500-person congregation evaluating every detail. Just a small gathering of people who actually cared about the couple's happiness, assembled in ancient stone arches while winter light filtered through stained glass. Sharon wore a dress of cream silk, elegant but not elaborate, chosen because she liked it, rather than because it would photograph impressively. Her hair was dressed simply, adorned only with a few winter roses from Marguerite's garden. As she walked down the aisle on Marguerite's arm, her aunt having earned that honor through unwavering support, Sharon realized something profound. She wasn't thinking about what she was supposed to feel, wasn't cataloguing whether her expression appeared appropriately joyful or her posture sufficiently graceful, wasn't mentally rehearsing the receiving line protocol or worrying about social consequences. She was simply present, fully, genuinely present, experiencing each moment as it unfolded, rather than performing it for an invisible audience. Adrian stood waiting at the altar, his dark eyes fixed on her with such open affection that Sharon felt her own eyes sting with tears. Happy tears this time, not the carefully suppressed anguish she'd carried down St. George's Chapel aisle 4 months earlier. The ceremony was brief, the words ancient but newly meaningful.
When the vicar instructed Adrian to place the ring, Sharon extended her hand and watched as he slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. No massive sapphire, no generations of dynastic symbolism, no weight of ancestral expectations. Just smooth, warm gold that caught the light, representing something infinitely more valuable than any heirloom could convey. This ring represented her agency, her choice, a conscious decision to build a life on her own terms, rather than accept the one prescribed at birth.
I now pronounce you husband and wife,
the vicar intoned, smiling warmly. Adrian kissed her, and Sharon kissed him back, aware of nothing that this moment, this choice, this man who saw her clearly and loved what he saw. When they turned to face their small gathering of friends, Sharon wasn't the Duchess she'd failed to become. She was the Countess she'd chosen to be. And the difference changed everything. Spring came to Westmarch with unexpected gentleness, and by May, Sharon had grown comfortable in her new life. The rhythms of the countryside estate, the quiet mornings in Adrian's extensive library, the conversations that continued to challenge and delight her. When Adrian suggested they attend an art exhibition in London, Sharon's first instinct was refusal, but she recognized that impulse as fear, and she'd promised herself she would no longer let fear dictate her choices. The gallery was crowded with the fashionable set, though Sharon noticed the whispers had changed texture. No longer pitying or
Scandalized. They carried notes of curiosity, even grudging admiration. The jilted East daughter, who'd become a countess on her own terms, made for a more interesting story than simple tragedy. Sharon was studying a Turner seascape, Adrian's presence steady beside her, when she heard the voice she'd once imagined belonging to her future. Miss East, forgive me, Lady Westmarch. She turned to find Patrick and Laura standing awkwardly nearby. Patrick looked uncomfortable in his formal attire, his handsome features marked by something that might have been regret or simply social embarrassment. Laura, by contrast, appeared genuinely radiant in rose silk, round with early pregnancy, her face alight with uncomplicated happiness. Sharon felt Adrian's hand settle at the small of her back. Not possessive, not claiming, simply present. A gesture of support that said, "I'm here if you need me." "Your Grace, Laura." Sharon's voice emerged calm, even warm. The title no longer carried any sting. "You look well," Patrick said stiffly, and Sharon nearly laughed at the inadequacy of the observation. "I am well. Very well, in fact." She glanced at Laura's condition. "Congratulations. I hope you'll both be very happy." Laura stepped forward impulsively, catching Sharon's hand. "I never meant. That is, I hope someday we might." She faltered, a distress genuine. "It's all right, Laura," Sharon said gently, and meant it. Truly, what's past is past. They exchanged a few more pleasantries, awkward but not hostile, before Patrick and Laura moved on. Sharon turned back to the painting, aware that Adrian was watching her carefully. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Sharon considered the question seriously. She'd just faced the man who'd publicly rejected her, the sister who'd inadvertently replaced her, and she felt nothing painful. No humiliation, no anger, not even the satisfaction of vindication. Just a profound, settling gratitude. "I'm more than all right," she said, meeting Adrian's concerned gaze with a smile. A real smile, unguarded and genuine, nothing like the practiced expression she'd perfected during those years of Duchess training. "Patrick's betrayal wasn't my tragedy, Adrian. It was my liberation. I'd been so busy trying to fit into the shape cut out for me that I never considered I might prefer a different shape entirely."
Adrian's expression softened with understanding and something deeper. Love, freely given and freely returned. I was groomed to be an ornament, Sharon continued, the words flowing easily now. Polished and positioned, and ultimately interchangeable. But you see me as a person, complex, flawed, still discovering who I am. And that makes all the difference. As they left the gallery, stepping out into the spring afternoon, Sharon breathed deeply. London no longer felt like the site of her greatest humiliation. It was simply a city, one she could visit or leave as she chose. Where to now? Adrian asked, offering his arm.
Sharon took it, feeling the rightness of her choice settle deeper. She was the Countess of Westmarch, author of her own story, defined not by a role she'd failed to fulfill, but by the courage it had taken to walk away and discover who she truly was. The woman who'd been publicly declared insufficient had become exactly sufficient unto herself.
Home,
She said simply.
let's go home.